Welcome to our Unit 6 Final Quiz Study Guide. In this video, we will review the tested concepts included in the final quiz for Unit 6 so that you can demonstrate your success on this assignment. You are strongly encouraged to use this video and any other material from your online course or provided by your teacher as you work through the questions on the quiz. So, let's get started. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which had been allied with Germany, suffered a crushing defeat. The empire's involvement in the war weakened it greatly as it faced military losses on many fronts. Following the defeat, the empire was dismantled, and much of its land was divided among the victorious powers, particularly Britain and France. The collapse of the empire marked the end of over 600 years of Ottoman rule. Several factors contributed to the empire's fall. One key issue was that the Ottoman Empire was largely agrarian, meaning it depended heavily on farming and lacked the modern industries needed for a strong economy. Additionally, the empire was not cohesive enough to maintain power. Its diverse ethnic and religious groups had different interests and often fought against each other, weakening unity. The empire also had a large portion of its population that was undereducated, which made it hard to develop the skills necessary to keep up with modern changes happening in other parts of the world. Another important factor in the empire's decline was the rivalry with Russia, which had been ongoing for centuries. The Ottomans siding with Germany during the war worsened their relationship with Russia and other European powers. As a result, the empire was surrounded by stronger and more modern nations, which took advantage of its weakness. By the end of the war, the empire had lost much of its territory, and the remaining parts were too weak to recover. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 officially ended the Ottoman Empire, and in its place, the modern state of Turkey was created under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Proxy wars are conflicts where two powerful countries support different sides in a war, but they don't directly fight each other. Instead, they provide money, weapons, and training to the groups or countries they support. One of the most famous proxy wars happened in Korea, where the United States supported South Korea, and the Soviet Union, USSR, backed North Korea. The US wanted to stop the spread of communism, a political system where the government controls everything, while the USSR wanted to spread communism around the world. The Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, was a clear example of a proxy war. North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, wanted to make all of Korea a communist country. On the other hand, the United States and other countries in the United Nations supported South Korea to prevent the spread of communism. The war ended in a stalemate, and Korea was split into two countries, a communist North and a democratic South, which is still the case today. The Vietnam War, 1955 and 1975, was another proxy war, where the US and the USSR played important roles. The US supported South Vietnam to stop the spread of communism, while the USSR and China supported North Vietnam, which was trying to make all of Vietnam communist. The war was long and very costly for the US, and in the end, North Vietnam won, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under communist control. Both wars show how the US and the USSR fought each other indirectly by supporting different sides in other countries' conflicts. The United States became involved in the Vietnam War because of its policy of containment, which aimed to stop the spread of communism. The U.S. government believed in the domino theory, which said that if one country in Southeast Asia became communist, nearby countries would soon follow. To prevent this, the U.S. supported South Vietnam in its fight against North Vietnam, which was communist and supported by the Soviet Union and China. The U.S. thought that if they didn't stop communism in Vietnam, it would spread to other countries in the region. The Vietnam War was the first war to be shown on television, which had a huge impact on how people saw the conflict. As the war continued, Americans saw graphic images of the violence and suffering, which made many question whether the war was worth it. This led to a split in public opinion. Some people supported the war, believing it was necessary to stop communism, while others opposed it, feeling it was unjust and unnecessary. The war became very controversial, and many people felt that the government wasn't being honest about what was happening. During the Vietnam War, There was also the rise of the counterculture movement, which was made up mostly of young people who rejected traditional values. Many in the counterculture were against the war, protesting against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Large demonstrations and marches took place, and people used music, art, and speeches to express their opposition. The protests grew in size as the war dragged on, showing a divide between those who supported the war and those who wanted peace. The Opium Wars were two conflicts between Qing China and Western countries, primarily Britain in the 19th century. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, began when China tried to stop the illegal opium trade. British traders were bringing opium into China from India, and by 1820 many people in China were addicted to it. The Chinese government was concerned about the effects of the drug on its population, so they took action to try and end the trade. However, Britain was making a lot of money from selling opium, and they didn't want to lose their profits, leading to a war between China and Britain. The First Opium War ended with a victory for Britain, and China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This treaty was very unfair to China and is known as an unequal treaty because it gave Britain control over Hong Kong and forced China to open up more ports for British trade. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, happened because both Britain and France wanted more power and trade rights in China. They both fought against China to force more concessions, and China lost again, leading to even more unequal treaties. The Opium Wars weakened China's power and economy, and the treaties from these wars humiliated the Qing dynasty. As a result, China's ability to control its own affairs was greatly reduced. This period of humiliation and foreign influence contributed to the eventual downfall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, marking the end of imperial rule in China. In 1921, the Communist Party of China, CPC, was formed, and it aimed to bring change to China by supporting the poor and working class. In 1927, a major event called the Shanghai Massacre occurred, where Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, ordered the killing of many Communist Party members. This event led to the creation of the Communist Red Army, a military group that fought for communist control. Soon after, the country was plunged into a civil war between the Communists and the Nationalists, with both sides fighting for control of China. By 1949, the civil war had ended, and the Communists, led by Mao Zedong, were victorious. The Nationalists were defeated and fled to Taiwan. Mao Zedong declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China, with the Communist Party now in control of the government. In the years that followed, Mao pushed for economic and social changes to transform China into a powerful nation. From 1958 to 1962, he introduced the Great Leap Forward, a plan to turn China from a mostly farming country into an industrial one. However, the plan failed, leading to widespread famine and many deaths. From 1966 to 1976, Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution, aiming to eliminate capitalist and Western influences from China and focus on traditional Chinese values. He encouraged the youth, known as the Red Guards, to target anyone suspected of being against his ideas, which led to violence and the destruction of cultural heritage. The Cultural Revolution caused widespread chaos, and many people were persecuted, tortured, or killed. The movement ended in 1976 after Mao's death, but it left a deep impact on Chinese society and politics. Communism is an idea that promotes a society where all people are equal, and there is no private ownership of land or businesses. It first spread into the countryside of China from the cities, inspired by European socialist ideas, and the October Revolution in Russia, where communists took power. In China, many people in rural areas were poor and oppressed by landlords, who controlled the land and took a large portion of the farmers' crops. Communism offered a solution, promising to take power away from the rich landlords and give it to the common people, especially the farmers. One of the main goals of communism is to fight against imperialism and the exploitation of workers, especially farmers. In China, the Communist Party promised to end the unfair system where a few wealthy landlords controlled most of the land and resources. Communism wanted to create a society where everyone had equal access to land and wealth. This message was especially appealing to the poor and oppressed people living in the countryside, who had long struggled under the control of the wealthy and foreign powers. During World War II, when Japan invaded China, it was the Communist Party that played a key role in defending the country. While the nationalist government struggled, the Communists were able to organize effective resistance against the Japanese. They built strong support among the rural population by offering them land and protection. This helped the Communist Party gain even more power and influence, leading to their eventual victory in the Chinese Civil War. The events in Tiananmen Square began on April 17, 1989, when students gathered to mourn the death of Hu Yaobang, a former leader of the Communist Party who was seen as a reformer. Many students admired Hu for his calls for political reforms, and his death led to a wave of grief and anger. On April 22nd, the protests grew as students began to boycott their classes and form student unions. They were demanding more freedom of speech, political reforms, and an end to corruption. The movement quickly gained attention, and press coverage of the protests spread, making the government more aware of the situation. From April 29th to May 3rd, the protests continued to grow, and the government became more divided on how to respond. Some party leaders were in favor of trying to control the protests with force, while others believed they should try to negotiate with the students. The disagreement within the government made it difficult to decide on a clear course of action. Meanwhile, the students continued their demonstrations in Tiananmen Square, with many calling for changes in the political system and more freedom for the people. On May 13th, the students organized a hunger strike to show their determination. Thousands of students and other supporters participated, which drew more attention to the protests both inside and outside of China. As the protests continued, the government made a decision on June 2nd to use force to put down what they called a counter-revolutionary riot. On June 4th, the military moved in to clear the square, and violent clashes resulted in the deaths and injuries of many people. The Chinese government's response to the protests was harsh, and the incident remains a highly sensitive topic in China. In the spring of 1989, a series of protests took place in China, centered around Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The protests began with college students, who were angry about corruption in the government and wanted more political reforms. These students, along with many other people, called for changes in the Communist Party, including greater freedom of speech and an end to corruption. As the protests grew, more people from different parts of China joined in, making it a large movement across the country. The Chinese government was worried about the growing protests and the pressure for political change. The students were not only demanding reforms but also speaking out against the government's control over many aspects of life. As the protests continued into May, the Chinese government became increasingly concerned about the movement's size and its potential to challenge the authority of the Communist Party. Despite the peaceful nature of the protests, the government saw them as a threat. On June 4, 1989, the government decided to use military force to end the protests. Troops and tanks were sent to Tiananmen Square to clear out the protesters. The military used violence to break up the crowds, and many people were killed or wounded. The Chinese government declared the protests to be a counter-revolutionary riot and shut down all public discussion about it. The events at Tiananmen Square are still a sensitive and censored topic in China today. The decolonization of Africa was a process in which many African countries gained their independence from European powers. Before independence, many African nations were controlled by European countries. For example, Britain controlled countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, while France had colonies in West Africa, Algeria, and Morocco. Other European countries, like Belgium and Portugal, also controlled parts of Africa, such as the Congo, Belgium, and Angola, Portugal. The independence of African nations took place mainly after World War II. In 1951, Libya became the first African country to gain independence from European rule, which inspired other countries to seek freedom. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, many African countries fought for independence. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence in 1957, followed by countries like Nigeria in 1960, Algeria in 1962, and Kenya in 1963. By the 1970s and 1980s, many other countries had gained independence, with Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, becoming independent in 1980 and Namibia in 1990. The process of decolonization was not always peaceful. Some countries, like Algeria, fought long and violent wars for independence from France. Other countries, like South Africa, faced a system of racial segregation called apartheid, which was only officially ended in 1994 when Nelson Mandela became president. The decolonization of Africa led to the creation of many new nations and a major shift in the political landscape of the continent. After World War II, starting in the 1950s, many African nations began to fight against colonial rule. For years, African people had resented being controlled by European countries, and after the war they became more determined to gain their independence. The war had weakened many European powers, making it harder for them to maintain control over their colonies. Many African countries saw this as an opportunity to push for freedom and end colonial domination. World War II also created new opportunities for African nations. During the war, many European countries needed soldiers and supplies, which led to more labor and export opportunities for African colonies. African workers contributed to the war effort, and this experience helped them see their potential power and importance. This growing sense of pride and demand for change played a key role in the push for independence across the continent. In addition, the United Nations, UN, was established after World War II, and it played an important role in supporting African independence. The UN created a charter that granted countries the right to self-rule, meaning that nations could govern themselves without foreign control. This gave African nations a legal and moral framework to demand independence, and the world began to support their efforts. As a result, many African countries gained their independence in the 1950s and 1960s, marking the end of colonial rule in Africa. Nelson Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid activist and the first black president of South Africa. He was born in 1918 and grew up in a small village. Mandela studied law at the University of Witwatersrand, and after becoming a lawyer, he became involved in politics. He joined the African National Congress, ANC, a group that fought against apartheid, a system of racial segregation that treated black South Africans as second-class citizens. Mandela worked hard to change the system and make South Africa a fairer country for everyone. Mandela's fight against apartheid led to his arrest in 1962. He was convicted for organizing protests against the apartheid government and sentenced to life in prison. He spent 27 years in prison, mostly on Robben Island, where he faced harsh conditions. During his time in prison, Mandela became a symbol of the struggle for freedom and equality. Around the world, people protested for his release, and he became a powerful symbol of resistance against apartheid. In 1990, Mandela was released from prison, and he played a key role in ending apartheid to avoid a civil war in South Africa. By 1994, the apartheid system was officially over, and South Africa held its first democratic elections where all races could vote. Mandela was elected as the first black president of South Africa. He worked to unite the country, heal its divisions, and build a more just society. His leadership and commitment to peace made him a global icon for human rights. In 1994, Rwanda experienced a brutal genocide in which between 500,000 and 800,000 Tutsi people were killed or tortured. The Tutsi were the minority group in Rwanda, making up about 15% of the population, while the Hutu people, who made up the majority, were responsible for carrying out the violence. Tensions between the Tutsi and Hutu had been growing for years, but the situation exploded into mass killing when the plane carrying the Rwandan president, a Hutu, was shot down. This sparked the Hutu-led government and militia groups to begin a campaign of violence against the Tutsi population, as well as moderate Hutus who opposed the killings. The genocide lasted for about 3 months, and it wasn't until July 1994 that the Tutsi-led Rwandese Patriotic Front, RPF, a rebel group, took control of the country. This victory by the RPF led to even more violence as they fought the remaining Hutu forces, and many Hutus fled the country to avoid being blamed for the killings. By the end of the conflict, nearly 2 million people had become refugees, seeking safety in neighboring countries like Uganda and Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Rwandan genocide was a huge humanitarian crisis that left the world questioning why more was not done to stop the violence. Both the United Nations and the United States were criticized for failing to intervene quickly. The UN had peacekeepers in Rwanda, but they were not given the mandate to stop the killings. The situation was seen as too far away and of little national interest. So many countries did not act until after the worst of the genocide was over. This failure to prevent or stop the killings remains a painful chapter in world history. As we conclude Unit 6, let us reflect on the lessons history has taught us. From the collapse of empires to the ideological battles of the Cold War, and from independence movements to the devastating consequences of war and genocide, we see the profound impact of human actions and inactions on the world. The Rwandan genocide of 1994, where over 800,000 lives were lost in just 100 days, stands as a stark reminder of the cost of inaction. As Kofi Annan said on the 20th anniversary of the genocide in 2014, "Let us not forget that genocide begins with the killing of one man, not for what he has done, but because of who he is." This tragedy challenges us to ask, when should we, as a global community, take action against war, violence, and genocide? What factors should prompt us to intervene, and how can we make a difference? Will you raise awareness, advocate for change, or support organizations on the ground? These are critical questions for us all to consider, not just as students, but as global citizens. As you prepare for the Unit 6 final test, use this video and all available resources to deepen your understanding of these events and demonstrate your mastery. Let these lessons inspire you to think critically about your role in creating a more just and compassionate world. Good luck, and thank you for engaging with these important topics. Together, we can learn from the past to shape a better future.